4 little girls walked into their church one Sunday morning, expecting nothing more than a day of prayer, hope, and community. Instead, they never walked out. Imagine that innocence shattered by a force so dark, so evil, that it would target children to send a message. This wasn't just an act of terror, it was a message of hatred, a violent declaration that some would rather destroy lives than see equality rise. Today, we're diving into the 1963 Birmingham Church bombing, one of the most horrific moments in American history. But why? Why did this happen? What fueled this madness? What kind of hatred burns so deep that it takes the lives of children? Today, we'll explore the greed for power, the desperation to maintain supremacy, and the twisted motives behind one of the civil rights movement's darkest days. Now, let's zoom in on Birmingham, Alabama in the 1960s. This wasn't just any city in the South, it was a war zone in the fight for civil rights. Known by many as Bombingham because of the relentless wave of racially motivated bombings, the streets echoed with tension, fear, and anger. Black Americans were mobilizing, demanding their right to vote, to sit in public spaces, and to live without the constant threat of violence. But on the other side, segregationists were determined to keep their grip on power, fueled by a greed for control and dominance. They saw equality not just as a threat to their way of life, but as a threat to their status, their identity, their greed for supremacy. Violence was their weapon of choice, and Birmingham was the battleground where this fight for freedom and resistance to change collided in brutal fashion. The 16th Street Baptist Church wasn't just a place for Sunday services. It was the heart of Birmingham's black community, a refuge where hope, strategy, and strength came together. This wasn't just any church. During the height of the civil rights movement, this building was the very pulse of the fight for equality. Activists, including Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and Fred Shuttlesworth, used the church as a staging ground for protests, marches, and sit-ins. It was where plans were laid out for some of the most pivotal moments in the movement, like the Birmingham Campaign, a series of nonviolent protests that shook the foundations of segregation. But to those who fought to maintain white supremacy, this church represented a direct challenge. It wasn't just a place of worship, it had become a nerve center for civil rights activism. The sight of black Americans organizing, strategizing, and fighting for their dignity sent waves of fear and anger through the segregationist community. For the Ku Klux Klan, the 16th Street Baptist Church wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of black resistance, a reminder that their grip on power was slipping. By 1963, the Klan was desperate to stop the growing momentum of the civil rights movement, desperate to intimidate, to silence, and to crush the spirit of those fighting for justice. The church became their target, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, a beacon of hope and defiance. Bombing it wasn't just an act of terror. It was a strategic attack meant to send a message. If you keep pushing for change, we will destroy you. This church, which had provided shelter and hope for so many, suddenly became the epicenter of one of the most vicious and cold-blooded acts of the civil rights era. The Ku Klux Klan wasn't just some fringe group of racists lurking in the shadows. In the 1960s South, they were a deeply embedded terrorist network, operating with terrifying impunity. Their power ran deep into the police, the courts, and local governments. These weren't just men in hoods. These were your neighbors, local business owners, law enforcement officers, people with power and influence. But the Klan's motivation was far darker than mere hatred. It was about greed. Not for money, but for power, for control, and for maintaining a brutal social hierarchy that kept black Americans subjugated. The Klan thrived on fear, and their grip on society was rooted in terror. The civil rights movement was shaking the very foundation of the world they'd known. Every protest, every sit-in, every demand for equal rights felt like another crack in the walls of the society. They had built a society where white supremacy was the unchallenged rule. They were terrified of losing control, of losing their place at the top of the racial hierarchy. This wasn't just about hating black people, it was about preserving a system where they held all the cards, where they made the rules. The men who planted the bomb under the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church, men like Robert Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, and Thomas Blanton, were driven by this desperate fear of losing their dominance. The idea that black Americans might achieve equality was seen as a direct threat to their way of life. To them, bombing that church wasn't just an act of terror, it was an attempt to reassert their dominance, to send a message to anyone daring to demand equality. We still hold the power, and we will destroy anyone who threatens it. Their greed for supremacy led them to believe that violence was the only way to maintain their control. They were men who couldn't imagine a world where they weren't on top, where black Americans were equal in the eyes of the law. For them, it wasn't enough to disagree, they needed to dominate, to keep black Americans in their place, and they would stop at nothing, even if it meant murdering children. The bombing was their attempt to instill fear and to remind the world that they were willing to go to any lengths to preserve their supremacy. It was the act of men who saw equality as a threat and violence as their only answer. It's almost impossible to truly grasp the horror of that morning. Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carole Robertson, and Denise McNair, these were just girls. They weren't marching in the streets, leading protests, or making speeches. They were children, sitting in their church's basement on a Sunday morning, getting ready for their youth service. 4 young lives, ranging from 11 to 14 years old, just beginning their journeys, filled with hopes, dreams, and a future that should have stretched out far ahead of them. That morning, they weren't thinking about the battles being fought outside the church walls. They were thinking about Sunday school, their friends, maybe the songs they were going to sing. But that sanctuary, what should have been the safest place for them, became the site of unspeakable violence. At 10:22 am, when that bomb went off, the world for these 4 girls ended in an instant. The blast tore through the church, reducing walls to rubble, sending debris flying, and silencing their lives forever. Their deaths were not just a tragedy, they were a grotesque reminder of the cost of unchecked hatred and violence. These were children, not soldiers in a war. Yet, in the eyes of their killers, they were collateral damage in the fight to maintain a racist system. The innocence of their young lives made the attack even more heart-wrenching, highlighting the sheer depravity of a group willing to kill children to preserve their grip on power. Addie, Cynthia, Carole, and Denise didn't deserve to become martyrs for a movement they were too young to fully understand. But in the aftermath, their deaths ignited a firestorm of outrage and sorrow across the nation, forcing Americans to confront the true face of the hatred that had been hiding in plain sight. Their names became symbols of the cost of hate, reminders that the fight for equality had a price, and that price, too often, was paid in innocent blood. At exactly 10:22 am, everything changed. In an instant, the quiet of a Sunday morning turned into chaos as a bomb, made from 15 sticks of dynamite, detonated under the steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church. The explosion ripped through the building, sending bricks, glass, and debris flying. The force of the blast was so powerful, it reduced a section of the church to rubble, blowing out walls and shattering windows. The basement, where the 4 girls had gathered for Sunday school, was destroyed, trapping them in the wreckage. This wasn't just a random act of terror, it was a deliberate, calculated attack. A church, a place of peace, a sanctuary, was chosen as the target for a reason. The bombers wanted to send a message loud and clear. By choosing this church, a central hub of the civil rights movement, they were aiming to strike fear into the hearts of black Americans and their allies. The message was brutal and direct. We will destroy everything you hold sacred if you continue to push for change. It wasn't just about killing. It was about breaking the spirit of a movement that was gaining momentum. But this attack backfired. Instead of halting the civil rights movement, the explosion became one of its defining moments. The image of a church reduced to ruins by an act of hatred shook the nation to its core. This wasn't a battlefield in some far-off war zone. This was an American city. And the victims weren't soldiers or politicians, they were innocent children. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church exposed the depths of racial hatred in the South, forcing the nation to confront the real cost of segregation and white supremacy. In trying to strike fear, the bombers ignited something far greater, a renewed urgency for justice. The explosion that was meant to silence only amplified the cries for change, galvanizing the civil rights movement and pushing the struggle for equality into a new, more determined phase. Why? Why would anyone plant a bomb in a church where children were gathering? What kind of person wakes up, takes 15 sticks of dynamite, and chooses to target a place meant for peace? The horrifying answer lies in a toxic blend of fear and greed, two forces that have driven humanity's darkest actions throughout history. The men responsible for this bombing were not just racists, they were defenders of a way of life that was slipping away. They were terrified of a world where they no longer held the upper hand. For generations, they had lived in a system that placed them on top, a system where white supremacy was the norm and segregation was the law. The growing momentum of the civil rights movement threatened that world. It threatened their control, their power, their identity. The thought of equality, of sharing power and rights with black Americans, was unthinkable to them. And so they acted out of greed. Not the kind of greed you might think of when someone hoards wealth, but a greed for social dominance. Their greed was for a world where they continued to have control, where black Americans remained beneath them in the social hierarchy. To them, preserving white dominance wasn't just a preference, it was a necessity, and they were willing to use terror, violence, and even the lives of children to maintain it. This wasn't about money or material gain. It was about power, about keeping their place in a system that benefited them at the expense of others. They were desperate, knowing that the civil rights movement was gaining ground, knowing that their world of segregation was being dismantled brick by brick. That desperation pushed them to murder, to bomb a church, and to kill innocent children, all in the name of maintaining a cruel and unjust status quo. Their motive was clear: stop the march toward equality at all costs. And for them, that cost included the lives of Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carole Robertson, and Denise McNair. In their minds, this was a sacrifice they were willing to make to keep a stranglehold on power. Justice, when it finally came far too slowly. The Birmingham Church bombing shocked the nation, but in Alabama, in the heart of the segregated South, the wheels of justice barely moved. The bombers, members of the Ku Klux Klan, weren't exactly hiding. The FBI knew who they were, and so did local authorities. But here's the catch: many of those same authorities, from the police to the courts, were sympathetic to segregationist views. They were more aligned with the men who planted the bomb than with the families of the victims. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, investigated the bombing, but justice was deliberately delayed. Hoover himself was notoriously unsupportive of the civil rights movement, and though the FBI identified the perpetrators Robert Chambliss, Bobby Frank Cherry, Thomas Blanton, and Herman Cash, there was little political will to pursue them. The atmosphere in Alabama was one of complicity, where racist violence often went unpunished, and where the idea of convicting white men for the murder of black children seemed unthinkable to those in power. For years, the case languished. It wasn't until 1977, more than a decade after the bombing, that Robert Chambliss, the ringleader, was finally brought to trial and convicted of murder. Even then, it wasn't a clean victory for justice. Chambliss had lived freely for years, while the families of Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carole Robertson, and Denise McNair had to live with the painful knowledge that their daughter's killers were walking around without consequence. It took decades for the others involved in the bombing to face justice. In 2001, Thomas Blanton was convicted, followed by Bobby Frank Cherry in 2022. Herman Cash died before he could be prosecuted. The wheels of justice in this case turned painfully slow, weighed down by the same forces of racial bias and hatred that motivated the bombing in the first place. The reluctance to act to hold these men accountable was a grim reflection of the deep-rooted racism in the South at the time, a racism that allowed violence to go unpunished and protected those who sought to terrorize the black community. It wasn't just the bombers who were on trial. It was the entire system that had allowed their hatred to fester unchecked for so long. The bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but it also became a catalyst for change. The sight of four innocent girls, Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carole Robertson, and Denise McNair being murdered while they prepared for Sunday school sent shockwaves across the country. The nation could no longer turn a blind eye to the brutal realities of segregation. This wasn't just a local issue in Birmingham. It was a national crisis that revealed the true depths of racial hatred in America. For many white Americans who had been indifferent or unaware of the violent resistance to the civil rights movement, the bombing was a wake-up call. The image of children killed by a bomb planted in a church, a supposed sanctuary, was a grotesque symbol of how far segregationists were willing to go to maintain their hold on power. The sheer horror of the attack forced the country to confront the moral failure of allowing such hatred to persist. The deaths of these four girls didn't halt the civil rights movement as the bombers had hoped. Instead, it gave it new momentum. The bombing became a rallying cry for justice, fueling widespread outrage that crossed racial and geographic lines. The shock and grief over this senseless act of violence helped to accelerate the push for meaningful legislative change. Within months, the tragedy of Birmingham was a major influence on the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, two of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history. What the bombers sought to destroy, hope, progress, and unity, only grew stronger in the aftermath. The world had seen the face of evil, and the demand for justice was louder than ever. The bombing marked a turning point, not only in the civil rights movement, but in the collective conscience of America. It was a stark reminder that the fight for equality wasn't just about laws and policies. It was a battle for the soul of the nation. The legacy of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing lives on, not just in the tragic loss of those four young lives, but in the undeniable shift it caused. The bombers had intended to stop progress, but their violent act only fueled it, pushing the movement forward with a renewed urgency and a deeper sense of purpose. Even after more than 60 years, the Birmingham church bombing is not just a story from the past, it still haunts us. The echoes of that terrible day remind us of the profound dangers of hatred left unchecked. It's a stark warning of what happens when greed for power, for supremacy, festers in the dark corners of society. This wasn't just an attack on a church, it was an assault on hope, on equality, and on the very idea of progress. Yes, the civil rights movement made historic strides in the wake of this tragedy. Laws were passed, doors were opened, and the country changed in ways that many once thought impossible. But the fight for racial equality is far from over. The same greed for control, the same fear of losing power that drove men to plant that bomb still lingers in different forms today. The violence may look different, but the motives are often the same: fear of losing privilege, fear of a changing world, and a desperate greed to hold on to supremacy. The legacy of the Birmingham church bombing and the lives of Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carole Robertson, and Denise McNair must continue to inspire us. Their deaths cannot be in vain. We must confront hatred and greed whenever and wherever we see it. We must challenge the systems that allow inequality to persist, and we must never forget the cost of staying silent in the face of injustice. Greed for power and supremacy is still here, lurking in policies, in systems, and in the hearts of those unwilling to let go of a world built on inequality. The fight isn't over, and neither is the need to stand against it. Thank you for joining me today as we unpacked this devastating chapter in American history. We must continue to tell these stories, to honor the victims, and to learn from the past to prevent future atrocities. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay committed to justice.